right, so today we're going to keep talking a little bit about some of the effective strategies that we can use for encoding. So how do we save information into long-term storage for later? And this is the part of the class that I always wish that we could teach at the beginning, because this is basically effective study strategies. But it ends up tying in with memory, where we need to have that basis of which brain areas do what, and talking about science and all of that. So it's one of those things where the timing only ever works for the end of the semester, but hopefully some of the strategies will be helpful for you moving forward. But yeah, it's always weird to be at the end of the semester and then being like, hey, here's some effective study strategies and why. But yeah, hopefully some of these are strategies that you have yourselves used in the past. But so we're going to start answering, okay, how do we improve our memory? How can we more effectively retain information so that we can recall it later at a future date? And so the first distinction we're going to look at is sort of the timing of our studying. So we want to have an effective use of timing in our study strategies. So we have two different options. We can use a spaced practice or a massed practice. And massed practice is what you would call cramming, when you sit down and do all of your studying all at once. So you try and remember absolutely everything in a single sitting or in a very short period of time, and usually without any gaps between repetitions. So an example of cramming would be the night before an exam. You sit down, you open up your psych textbook for the first time, and you read it from cover to cover twice. That would be cramming. A better practice would be to use what's called spacing. And the spacing effect is basically this idea that if you can spread out your study periods, so even if you study for the same amount of time, so say instead of having a 60-minute study session in one day, maybe you do 3 20-minute sessions spread out over an entire week. You're actually going to perform significantly better when you spread out your study periods. And so the idea there is that if you can space it out, you're going to be accessing that information at 3 different periods, and you have some time in between, almost for your brain to mull over that information. And then the next time when you come back and practice it again, you're retrieving and working with that information again and then re-encoding it. And so each time you're retrieving and re-encoding the information when you're done with it, and you're making sort of more and more connections to that part of the brain where that information is stored. So the more times you access it, and especially over a longer period of time, the better you'll be able to recall it in the future. And this spacing effect actually works not just for semantic memory like you would think of for standard studying, but it also works for episodic memory, so remembering things that have happened to you, but also for procedural memory. So if you wanted to get really good at roller skating in a very short period of time, you'd actually do a lot better doing multiple short sessions of practice instead of one long session. So this works for all kinds of long-term memory. The next strategy that we're going to talk about is something called mnemonics. And mnemonics it's sort of weird. As a child, I was exposed to mnemonics as sort of a symbol or a single simple thing that you could do to help your memory. But in fact, it's actually a name that describes sort of a whole bunch of different techniques. So mnemonics are just techniques that help provide a framework for you to effectively encode and recall information. So there are tons of different techniques that you can use. There's a couple here. They have the peg word method, keyword method, method of loci, acronyms, and initializations. I actually separate out the ones that I like using, or the ones that I find at least interesting to talk about, onto this slide here. And so here I break it down into 4 broad categories. So we have simple mnemonic devices, semantic mnemonic devices, visual-based ones, and then complex mnemonic devices. And so the simple ones are actually not too far off from what we talked about when we were saying, how can we recall information, or how do we work with more information in our immediate memory? So we've already talked about chunking as sort of grouping information together into some kind of meaningful, larger assembly. And then a hierarchy is actually going to work in a very similar fashion. So let's start there with our simple mnemonics. So we said that chunking is combining items into larger units of meaning. So if you're trying to remember a phone number, instead of remembering all 10 digits, maybe you're going to remember the area code as one set of numbers, and then the first 3 is the next set, and then the last 4 as another set. And for whatever reason, that is easier for our brains to remember. If we were given a list of, say, 10 items, and 3 of those items were colors, and 3 were animals, and the remaining 4 were just items, we might be able to remember that list better if we say, okay, I need to know 3 colors, here's what they are. Because then when you're recalling, you'd be like, okay, what were the colors? Okay, and what were the animals? And what were the items? So by grouping them like that, it just gives us that extra thing to help us remember. And this, very similar to this concept, is the idea of hierarchies. So if you can organize items based on how they are related to one another. So we basically assign some kind of sort of nesting level to each of these items. And this only works for certain kinds of lists. So if you had to remember something that's sort of a house level, and then a neighborhood level is a little bit larger, and then the city, and then the country. So if you're trying to remember an address, you would probably want to group it between sort of house number, maybe neighborhood, maybe, or I guess street, city, country. And so that would help enhance your memory because you have these associations. So instead of just trying to remember a random list of, well, there's a house number and a street and a this and a that, you'd be putting them into, okay, so what's the house number? What's the street? What's the city? What's the country? And by having that order, it really helps you, again, just have sort of extra levels of information introduced that makes it easier to recall. And so when we have these hierarchies, there's been a lot of different studies. Again, all of these are pretty much done using lists of words and asking people to remember long lists of words. But if you ask people to put items into random hierarchies versus hierarchies that actually make logical sense, those that have logical hierarchies actually end up performing a lot better than those who have invented new ones. So if we work on something that has a natural hierarchy, like maybe we're grouping things based on size, and you have to remember this many small, medium, and large things, versus if we had a hierarchy of blue, green, and yellow things, one of them would help a lot more than the other. So if we have meaningful hierarchy, that's going to help. And so you should start picking up on a pattern here, where for each of these techniques, we start talking about how involving more systems or sort of evoking some existing meaning or going over something multiple times, more is almost always better when it comes to memory. So whether we're encoding that information or retrieving that information, we want more things in order to help that happen better. And the way that I like to visualize this is if you're going to the part of your brain that is storing that information, if you have multiple things that you also associate with that area, then there are multiple paths that you can use to get to your information. So if you only have the shape of the word in your mind, but you don't have the meaning or a visual representation, then you only have one possible path. And if it erodes due to disuse, then you can't recall that item. But if we have all those other paths available to us, then we have other options. We have other paths that we can take, and then we're more likely to be able to recall. That's at least how I like to try and frame it, is sort of multiple paths, and then as we get into sort of multiple retrievals, maybe you have a more well-trodden path that's a lot less likely to erode over time. And that's a kind of nice way to visualize it. which is also a nice segue into our visual-based mnemonics. And we've already kind of touched on this as well. When we were talking about our grocery list, I mentioned the fact that it might be useful to actually visualize what items are on our list. Maybe you have a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, and a carton of eggs. And if you think of each of those items, that makes it a little bit more tangible than just the words themselves. So we've added in something else to it. Now we're involving our visual system as well as what we were already using. And then in this case, I've seen a couple of texts that focus on if you can have your items interact and if you can make them sort of strange or bizarre or stand out in some way. Basically, again, more is going to help with remembering. So by having your items interact with one another, that allows you to remember, okay, so the eggs and the milk were going together into a cake mix. And the bread sits on the counter where I'm going to make the cake, but the bread's for tomorrow morning. So we can have that sort of story where we know how they're going together, and that might help us remember all three items because now we know that they're related to one another. And then the bizarreness, this is basically just the idea that the more salient that you can make an item, the more it grabs your attention and the more it stands out, the easier it is to then remember that item later. So here they have some bizarre imagery, things doing things that they're not supposed to do. And by having that extra strangeness to it, it kind of makes it a little bit more salient and it sticks out just a little bit better in your mind. This is one that some people it works for them, some people it doesn't, but it's always a very strange image to include, so I can't ever leave this slide out. All right, our next are the semantic mnemonics. And so you should remember by now that when we talk about semantics, we're talking about meanings. And these are the kinds of things that we typically were taught in school. Things like the first letter technique or initialization, where you take the first letter of each word and make something easier to remember of that. So maybe you have to remember the order of all of the colors of the spectrum. So you were probably taught the Roy G. Biv as an acronym to remember the order of those colors, where it's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. I don't remember what the mnemonic was, but I know we had one to remember the order of the planets in our physics class. So you probably have a couple of these where the order of a particular catchy phrase helps you remember the order or the rank or something of some other item. That'd be a first letter technique. Another option is a narrative technique. So maybe you tell a story that helps you evoke all of those things that you need to remember. So it could be kind of similar to the first letter technique. Actually, I think the remembering the planets was closer to a narrative technique because it was a sentence that told a story. And I can't remember what it was, but it was something about your mother getting pizza so that you could do something. And it helped us remember which planets fell in which order. And then, of course, we had to overhaul that because at the end of my, I guess it was high school career, they removed Pluto, so we had to drop the end. So we came up with a new one. But for the very longest of times, I remembered it, but not recently. All right, and then our last type of mnemonic is sort of the more complex mnemonics. And this is an interesting one because for the longest time, this method of loci was actually very difficult to explain to people because it's a very strange setup. But if you've actually seen the BBC's Sherlock, they show a really great example of this where Sherlock has a mind palace and he shows you how he stores information in this imagined location. And that's the perfect example of this method of loci. And so you link what you need to remember, the information that you're storing away, with a place that you know very, very well, whether it's a real physical location or an imagined location. And so the example that I use for this is I can use my own house. So maybe I want to remember my grocery list, and I know that I definitely need eggs and milk and bread, but I also need, maybe I need toothpaste, and I also need aerosols or something. I don't know. I need stuff. And so what I could do is when I'm making my mental grocery list, I would walk myself through my house and think, okay, start at the fridge. What do I need from the fridge? Well, eggs and milk go in the fridge, so that's what I'd need for the fridge. Okay, and on the counter next to the fridge, that's where I leave my bread and my fruits. Do I need bread and fruits? Yes or no. And then keep walking through that location. And so by adding that extra sort of, I'm trying to think of the right word for it here, I guess another degree of involvement, this other system that we're evoking here, we can then remember that information better. And this is kind of interesting because then when you're recalling that information, you would also be walking through that same space to try and remember what it is that you need for each of those locations. Now, some people will use these mental palaces in order to remember much more complex things and things that are less literal than a grocery list. For me, a grocery list is about the only time in my real life that I actually use this technique. But people will use this sort of technique to remember the order of playing cards in a deck of cards. There's a whole community of people who practice memorizing the order of all 52 cards in a deck by telling themselves a story that sort of plays out inside this mental palace. So it's one of those techniques that if you need to remember specific things, it's a good way to do it. It just doesn't quite click for me always. But yeah, it's also, if you wanted to get the clip of it, you can always Google the Sherlock Mind Palace, and they'll show you the clip from the show that helps illustrate this as well. All right, and then the last part of our encoding is actually going to be a really nice bridge into our discussion about retrieval. So retrieval practice is this idea that by repeatedly retrieving information, you actually end up storing that information more securely for the future. So this is that concept of having a more well-trodden path, where you put something away for storage and then you sort of leave it, but if you come back to it over and over and over again, the neurons that are involved in that particular connection are going to be used more, which means that those connections get strengthened, which means that you're less likely to forget them in the future. So repeated reading or exposure to the same information can actually lead you to recall that information better in the future. And the diagram that's on the slide here actually looks at a situation where they had sort of manipulated how much of this revisiting students did. So our blue bars are the ones who just reread their notes before a test. And then the orange bars are ones who reread their notes, but also tested themselves on the information. So they'd have multiple exposures to each individual item. And so at the bottom, we have our retention interval. So did they write the test 5 minutes after their re-exposure? Did they write it 2 days after their exposure, or 1 week later? And then we're just looking at sort of proportion of recall. So how well did they do? And so for our 5 minutes, we see no real difference, whether they were just rereading or multiple testing that information. But as we get into 2 days and 1 week, we see that our orange bars are much higher than the blue bars. And that tells us that the students who were testing themselves, who revisited that information a lot, ended up actually making stronger connections. And they had a better recall of that information because of it. And we see sort of trends like this in all sorts of different kinds of retrieval studies. Okay, and so I've done that thing again where I had wanted to include extra slides, but I don't think I included them on the website yet. I will make sure that I include those. I'm going to try and get Friday's slides up tonight as well, just so I know what we're covering. But yes, if you're following along with the slides from online, you won't have these yet, but you will shortly. But I wanted to be able to start just a little bit into the idea of retrieval. And you've probably figured it out by now, but retrieval is just that process of pulling information back out of long-term storage so that we can use it. So when we're getting you to write a test, you're using retrieval to pull the information that you stored while studying out of your long-term memory and putting it on the paper. So retrieval is our process of transferring information from our long-term memory back into our immediate memory or working memory, something that we are consciously aware of and that we can do stuff with. And now most of the failures of memory, which is our inability to remember something, most of these are actually failures to retrieve. We do a fairly good job of storing information away, but over time, if we don't use those pathways to that information, we can't find it again. So you end up with those situations of, I know that I know the answer, it's right there on the tip of my tongue, but I can't say the answer. It seems familiar and I should know it, but I don't. So that would be a failure of retrieval because you couldn't go and get that information. It's stuck somewhere. So how can we help that process? How do we make it easier to actually get that information? One of the best ways to do this is using cues. And cues are just stimuli that lead to activation of the information stored in our long-term memory. So maybe you're trying to remember, actually probably that mnemonic that I keep forgetting. If I wanted help remembering that, I could look it up, or I could have somebody give me a hint. And a hint would be a good cue. So maybe they tell me what the first word was, and that should get my memory started. Or there's different kinds of cues where they could give you something that's a hint. Maybe it's closely related, but it's not the same thing. So if you think of games like, I guess even charades or Pictionary, those would all be giving cues that should help someone recall specific information. And as per usual, more is better. So multiple cues are going to lead to better retrieval. And that's because, again, we're activating multiple parts of the brain. So maybe they're going to give you the first letter. They might also tell you how many words are in the phrase. They might also nudge you along with some other kind of hint. And the more hints you get, the more likely you are to retrieve that information correctly. And then if we look at the difference between self-generated cues and cues given by someone else, we actually see that we do a lot better with our own cues. And that kind of makes sense. You know how your mind works. If you've ever tried to play, say, charades or Pictionary with someone who you don't know very well, you might find it really difficult because you're using hints that don't mean anything to them. Whereas if you play with, say, a sibling or one of your best friends since childhood, it's almost like you can read each other's minds because you know how their mind works and you can give them hints that mean something. So by having that personal meaning, you do a lot better. So if we were doing one of those word list tests and you gave people the opportunity to make hints to help themselves remember, maybe you tell them that they can use any word except the word that's on the list. So maybe you go and you give a bunch of synonyms and you're given back your own list of synonyms for the recall task. You would probably do very well on that test. But if you were given someone else's list of synonyms, it might not help you as much because maybe your vocabulary is different. Maybe your preference in words isn't quite the same. So people tend to do a little bit worse when they have somebody else's cue, and they tend to do a lot better when they have their own. And then with cues, we can also kind of transition into our next topic, and this is the idea of priming. And priming is a really cool concept where we basically say that we're going to pre-activate or prime parts of our brains so that they're more likely to be active in the near future. So the idea here is almost like pre-exposure to something. You're like dropping hints in advance so that people are more likely to make a particular connection in the future. So if we were doing this in terms of psychological studies, maybe we have a 2-step experiment. And the first step is that I give you a list of 10 words. And on that list, we have the word store, and also house and tree and whatever, a whole bunch of short words. And maybe I get you to remember them, maybe I don't. Maybe they're completely irrelevant, and they're just there to distract you. Then our second task is I have a bunch of fill in the blanks here. And so I have the letters STO and then a blank. And if somebody has been pre-exposed to the word store, they're a lot more likely to fill that blank in with RE to make store than they are to fill it in with any other combination of letters, whether it be stork or stop. So by having that sort of pathway that leads us to the word or the concept of a store previously activated by the priming task, we actually see that we're more likely to recall the thing that we just saw. And so this is a kind of part of what's going on with advertising. People want that recognition. It's fresh in your mind. So maybe you're going out for groceries and you know that you want to get some kind of cola, but you just saw a commercial for Coca-Cola. And maybe you're one of those people that's on the fence between Coke and Pepsi. So because you've most recently seen Coke, you're more likely to reach for Coke. That would be priming in action. But it's not usually that straightforward. But this allows us to sort of make those, or sort of bias what people are more likely to recall in the future. So if you've ever watched, I guess like street magicians are really good for this, where they'll say things in such a way that it makes you think in a particular pattern. I've even done these with, like, they'll give you a list of questions and they'll ask you, what's the first thing that pops into mind? That's using priming tasks. So maybe they are talking about tools, but they also mention that you're going to be doing something that involves twisting. And then if they ask you for what tool comes to mind at first, you're going to think of something that also twists. So maybe you're more likely to think of screwdrivers. And so it's not a 100% guarantee, but we do see that you're more likely to think of those things that are already partially or entirely activated previously. Oh, and then this graph was actually very out of place. This was going along with cues that were created by either yourself or someone else. So I suppose this is we talked about it well enough without. But this is the idea that at the top we have that someone was able to use their own cues, and then what's their percent of words remembered. This is a weird one because the graph is almost flipped from what we're used to. We usually have percent remembered on the Y and then categories on the X. So this is just backwards. But we're seeing here that if you get to use your own cues, you have more of a recall. If you use someone else's cues, you tend to do poorly. And then if you don't get cues, and I guess here they're specifying you get someone else's cues, but you weren't allowed to practice with that information, you do very, very poorly. So this is again just showing that the more stuff we get, the more personalized it is, the better you're going to do. All right, and then the last of the contents that I want to focus on for today are the idea of our retrieval conditions. And so this is the idea that we want things to be as similar when we're encoding information as they are when we're trying to retrieve that information. So you've probably heard that if you're going to be taking an exam in a particular room, it's a good job or a good idea to try and study in that same room. Maybe people have told you that if you're chewing gum while you study, you should also chew gum while you take the test. Or you'd also like to take it at the same time of day. That's all sort of consistent with this idea of matching our retrieval conditions. So we can help our retrieval, we can do better at remembering things if we match the conditions at retrieval to the conditions that existed while we were encoding that information. And so we can focus on 3 specific ways to achieve matching, but these are all going to be very similar, and they all line up to say that you want as many things to be the same as possible. So we can look at encoding specificity, we can look at state-dependent learning, and then we're going to look at transfer-appropriate processing. And we're going to get very familiar with the same kind of concept because they all have very similar graphs to take a look at here. So our encoding specificity is telling us that we tend to learn information along with the context that we acquire that information in. So this is a study that was done back in the 1970s. This is a fairly long known phenomenon. And here they had set it up so that students would study either underwater, they were scuba divers, they would learn these vocabulary words while scuba diving, or they would learn them while sitting on the edge of a pool. So are they on land or are they underwater? And so then they had two testing conditions. Some people who studied underwater would be tested underwater, so the conditions would match, and some of them would be tested on land, where the conditions don't match. And then, of course, they'd want to do the opposite to make sure that it's not just that when you're studying underwater, you do very poorly. So they tested, okay, what about the people who learned on land? Test them underwater versus on land. And so from our diagram at the bottom here, so they don't have a label across the bottom, and that's because we're going to follow down from the top. So our first orange bar there are students who studied underwater and were tested underwater. And that y-axis is just the test score. So how many of the vocabulary words could they recall? And so when our conditions matched, studying underwater and testing underwater, we see that they did a lot better than if they studied underwater and were tested on land. And so if we go to the other side with our students who studied on land, if they were tested on land as well, their performance was better. But if they were tested underwater, they performed worse. And that's what the color coordinating here is. The orange bars are the ones where they matched and they do better, and the blue bars are the ones where they don't match and they do worse.
It might be completely different, but so like what if you, since with COVID and learning online, some people would have adapted to learning online and be better with online tests. So like what about people, because if it doesn't match, if we learn online now with computers and then you go online, did that have anything to do with it? Like if you do better on paper rather than online?
Possibly. It could be similar because like we're going to see that there's a lot of different things, like everything from like how tired you are when you're studying versus retrieving, all of it can matter. So if you're studying by practicing a bunch of multiple choice questions and then you're tested on a bunch of multiple choice questions, you're going to do better if it's the same format. But we also kind of run into that issue where you tend not to study the exact same way you retrieve, where you tend to study your notes and then you're tested in some other format. So it could be definitely part of it because the method of presentation absolutely matters. But yeah, there's lots of stuff that gets involved. And so this graph and this exact setup, we're going to see in multiple different ways. There we go. So this one is same basic setup, but this time done almost 20 years later. And the students studied with or without noise. So this would be, okay, they were in a room that has a white noise generator, or they're in a room that has no white noise generator. It's absolutely silent. And again, despite the fact that we've changed our conditions completely, we still see that if studying and testing match, those outside orange bars, you tend to be a lot higher. And if they don't match, they tend to be a lot lower. So this tells us that the situation where we encode that information should be as close to how we retrieve that information as possible. The next is state-dependent learning. And so this is specifically looking at our internal state. So I kind of hinted at that. So how tired you are, or how much caffeine is in your system, that can actually affect your ability to recall. And so here we would say that, okay, so if you're buzzed on caffeine when you're studying, you should make sure that you also have caffeine in your system when you're being tested. Again, we want as many things to match as possible between studying and retrieval. For non-drug examples, your mood. If you're happy when you're studying and you're happy while you're being tested, you're going to have better recall than if they don't match. levels of tiredness, fatigue, all of those things. Basically, whatever you can think of, they have run experiments to test this, and matching is going to be better. And so again, same basic graph setup, but this one was mood. So were students happy or sad when they were studying versus taking a test? And I believe for this experiment, they had set it up so that students would I think they had to tell a story of a memory that made them happy or a memory that made them sad right before studying and then right before they were tested. So theoretically, their mood would persist long enough for the duration of the test. But we see the exact same thing, where matching is better performance and non-matching is worse performance. And then the last of these sort of matching is better concepts is the idea of transfer appropriate processing. And this is going to be more related to the question about sort of online learning. But this says that memory performance is going to be better if the type of task at encoding matches the type of task at retrieval. So this is saying that if you're tested and you're testing yourself during studying in similar ways, you're going to typically perform better. So this is a slightly different visualization because it's not quite the same as what we've been looking at in terms of locations or states or anything like that. But this is basically saying, how are you studying and how are you then being tested on that material later? And so here they're saying, okay, so individuals at encoding while they were studying, they would either be asked something about the meaning of the word, or they would be asked if the word rhymes with something. So they'd be doing a semantic or a rhyming task. Okay, then at retrieval, we see that those who were tested with a rhyming recognition task and had been trained during the encoding process with rhyming, they did better. And so this is why sometimes when I'm studying for things like multiple choice tests that rely on recognition, I like to use things like cue cards because then I'm studying using a task that's based on recognition. And I sort of adjust my method of studying accordingly. So most of my undergrad degree was in biology, and it was exclusively memorization up until probably my 4th year. And so I have still at home, I have shoeboxes with thousands of cue cards that were just, each class had a Ziploc bag full of cue cards. And I would test myself on, can you recognize the term with the definition? And then when I sat down on the multiple choice tests, I would sort of see the question and it should pop into my mind what the correct definition or term, whichever it is I'm being tested on, would be. So I did a lot better. But if I was in a class that then switched and was getting me to think about things or make connections, testing just recognition during my studying time wouldn't necessarily be as helpful. That's one of the reasons why I focus right off the bat on telling you guys that I like to test on understanding, and that if you wanted to practice studying, you should try and explain a concept in its entirety to someone else. That's a good way to test yourself while studying that would help you with retrieval on the exam. So kind of matching up how you're used to handling that information with how you need to retrieve it at the end. So all of this is just a big way of saying that you want as many things the same while studying as testing as possible. And it's literally everything: time of day, internal state, external state, temperature, whatever you can imagine, there's a study on it. So that's why the big rule is as many things matching as possible will do better. All right, and that's what I have for today. And as I said, I'll make sure that I have these slides available to you guys along with the stuff for Friday. So I'll group those all together, and then hopefully we'll be done this chapter on Friday. All right.